Good morning. We are going to be completing Proverbs next couple of weeks because we want to begin Isaiah promptly when the quarterly says for us to. We're not going to be following exactly what the quarterly says, so hang with me. Today is an unusual lesson. It's important to me because it's history. But I hope by the end of the lesson it will be important to you because I think it explains some things that we need to know. We've talked a lot about Proverbs. We've talked a little bit about Solomon. And I want to talk about Solomon and a relationship, not a relationship, but a resemblance between King Solomon and King Hezekiah. And the reason we do that is in Proverbs chapter 25, the very first verse says, there are more Proverbs of Solomon collected by the advisors of King Hezekiah of Judah. Now, you read that and you say, okay, and you move on and you just keep reading. But that verse has so much information in it that we just sort of let slide by. So I want to take some time to talk about that today. Remember who Solomon's father was? King David. King David was a military might. Remember that he united all of the tribes into a nation. And King David left behind peace. Israel was united. They were at peace with their neighbors. Not an easy task to complete. They were prosperous. David left behind everything Solomon needed to build the temple. Solomon's job was to come in and complete the task that David had wanted to complete, but that God had put off until he could have a king of peace that could build his temple. David united the kingdom. He made the capital of Israel the city of Jerusalem. And he turns things over to Solomon, who reigns from around 970 BCE to 931 BCE. Everybody always talks about Solomon's wisdom, and we're going to address that a little bit later in the lesson. But I want you to be so aware of where Solomon started out as king. And I want you to think about, at the end of his reign, where the nation was. He initially, and I believe as he reigned, he sought justice and righteousness for the people of his nation. But by the time he left, 40 years of his administration, he left behind forced labor, extremely high taxation. Now, David had saved everything for the temple, had gotten everything together for the temple, but then Solomon went into huge building, activities that cost money. Therefore came the high taxation and the forced labor. And we can never forget that Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. That's a lot of mouths to feed. Solomon began his reign with every advantage. And his reign was completed because God had promised David that would happen. Solomon is the second son of David and Bathsheba. You remember that story. So at the end of David's reign, we have Solomon, who inherits a kingdom of peace and prosperity, who is wise and intelligent, but by the end of his reign, we have a civil war. Now, that's important. And we need to talk about why that happens and the results of it, because it's going to affect Hezekiah. We'll get into that. So, after Solomon's death, there is a civil war that erupts, and the 10 northern kingdoms divide from the 2 southern kingdoms. So we have the north, which is Israel, and the title is Shechem, Shechem. So that's a word you must know as you're reading through 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles. And I know you think, oh, who reads those? But you really want to. Get a translation like the New Living Translation or the ESV and read what happens with these people, because it's wonderful. So we have the northern kingdom, which is Israel, and we have the southern kingdom, which is Judah. You must remember that, because as you go through, it'll say, so-and-so was a good king of Judah. So-and-so was an evil king of Israel. I mean, it really takes you through the 2 nations in a chronological way, but you have to know which king of which nation to know what they're talking about. So, of course, the kingdom of Judah is Jerusalem. Okay, so Solomon leaves behind a divided family, a divided nation. Right after his death, during his son Rehoboam's reign, Egypt comes in. There's a huge battle in Jerusalem, and Egypt carries away many of the golden articles that were in the temple. The very things that Solomon took such pride in, that honored God, was taken away, partially because of the result of Solomon's reign. If you look through 1 Kings chapter 12, and you go through, 1 Kings chapter 12, we'll begin the Civil War. The northern tribes revolt, and they revolt primarily because of taxation. There's a lesson in there for that. If you read from 1 Kings through the end of 2 Kings, you have the destruction of the temple, which is going to come over here after Hezekiah. Why do we honor Solomon for his wisdom when in actuality he really let things fall apart? A lot of different reasons go into that, and we may talk about that in the next couple of weeks, but the lesson that I want to really strive for today is that Solomon began with everything. Power, prestige, possessions, he had it all. At the end of his life, he leaves a nation divided, under siege, in disarray. That's a small way to say it. And we get over to King Hezekiah, and we look at Proverbs chapter 25, verse 1. These are more Proverbs of Solomon collected by the advisors of King Hezekiah. Here's the important part. We're in the midst of a civil war. There are 28 kings in Judah during this division of the entire nation of Israel. 8 of whom are good. 8 kings out of a total of 28. In fact, Hezekiah's father is King Ahaz. King Ahaz ranks in the top two as being the most evil, the most corrupt. He is as far removed from a godly man as you can get. Hezekiah comes into this nation. He's 25 years old, and Hezekiah decides that he is going to follow God, that he's going to make a difference. And so he begins to lead his people back to a pattern of following God. In fact, he despised idolatry. He wanted people to worship God and God alone. And so he becomes king, and immediately he begins to take steps to bring his people back to a single worship of a single God. In fact, when you begin to read his story, one of the first decisions that he has to make as king, the Assyrians were powerful, and they were a great military power, and they had threatened Philistine cities and Israeli cities and Judean cities to pay a ransom in order to maintain their independence. And so most leaders decided it was just easier to pay the ransom than it was to fight the battle. So every year, annually, they would give these huge amounts of riches to the Assyrians. And the Philistines decided that they were tired of it. So they were going to form a coalition, politics. They were going to form a coalition to keep from paying that ransom. And so Hezekiah was invited to join that coalition. And instead of just deciding a political event, he goes and he seeks the word of God from God's prophet, who is Isaiah. Isaiah is who we're going to be studying in 2 weeks. And this is just a teaser for that study. But Isaiah receives a word from God, which is how it happened in the Old Testament. And do not be a part of this coalition. Trust me, I will take care of you, is what God tells Isaiah. In fact, Isaiah was so certain of this word from God that he ran through the streets of Jerusalem naked and said, if you join this coalition, this is what's going to remain of Judah. I mean, we will be nothing but a skeleton. So, what a great story. He knew that Hezekiah needed to honor God, needed to trust God, and not be part of a coalition with people who did not recognize God. What happens is that Sargon, who is the king of Assyria, devastated the Philistine cities, devastated them, but he left Jerusalem unharmed. Hezekiah became king during a really, really uncomfortable time. The riches of the nation were rapidly being depleted. The people were divided. Everything was on a blood level. Whoever was the biggest, whoever was the strongest, whoever was the mightiest, there was not justice in the system. And so Hezekiah, who follows in the footsteps of a really bad guy, becomes king, and he begins to bring about uniting his people for God. So think about this. What a great story. While Solomon didn't do everything right, I look at Solomon from the eyes of modern culture, and I really have to remind myself that Solomon wasn't a modern Western royalty. He was an ancient potentate. And despite the fact that rulers of that time would have had their position based on cruelty and bloodthirsty, ruthless leadership, Solomon established a pattern of justice and of mercy for his people that was different from anything else in their time. And he sets a pattern that Judeo-Christians still follow. In fact, we read his words for wisdom. He was foolish in the way that he lived, but his legacy to us are the words and wisdom that, if we follow, benefit our lives. So I want to look with me at Proverbs chapter 4. We're going to go ahead. Here we go. We're going to go all over the place again. Proverbs chapter 4 and verse 23. Solomon writes this. Now that you think about his life and the things that were going on in his life, when he says in verse 23, guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life. Think about that in his relationship with God and in Hezekiah's relationship with God, who had never heard these words, who had not been taught these words. And so as he instructs his administrators, as he gathers around him people who search through Israel's history, through Judah's history, and they find these gems of wisdom, then Hezekiah can read, guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life. Then he can put a whole new meaning to that hadn't been thought of before. Look in Proverbs chapter 5 and verse 21. We're going to read a couple of verses. It says, Proverbs chapter 5, 21. For the Lord sees clearly what a man does, examining every path he takes. An evil man is held captive by his own sins. They are ropes that catch and hold him. He will die for lack of self-control. He will be lost because of his great foolishness. I wonder at the end of his life if that's what Solomon wrote. If he realized the foolishness that he had exhibited and the results of it. And on the other hand, Hezekiah reads this and he realizes that every step that he makes must be worthy. When Solomon writes the entire chapter 7 about women, he probably understands exactly what he's writing about. The one that I find most important, Proverbs 10 and verse 25. When the storms of life come, the wicked are whirled away, but the godly have a lasting foundation. That applies not just to us, but the principle applies to our nation. And Hezekiah knew that the foundation that he built his government upon had to be worthy. Chapter 11, verse 14. I think when Hezekiah read this, he understood. Without wise leadership, a nation falls. Got it? Without wise leadership, a nation falls. There's safety in having many advisors. He reads that. He puts together a group of people who are going to help him lead the nation back to God. Proverbs 14 and verse 34. Godliness makes a nation great. Do you hear that? Godliness makes a nation great, but sin is a disgrace to any people. And probably one of the most influential verses that Hezekiah might have read would be Proverbs chapter 28, and just the first sentence, because it says, when there is moral rot within a nation, its government topples easily. Do you hear what it says? Let me read it again, because that principle that applied to Solomon and 200 years later applies to Hezekiah, applies to 2020. It says, when there is moral rot within a nation, its government topples easily. The verse, chapter 25 and verse 1, these are more Proverbs of Solomon collected by the advisors of King Hezekiah of Judah. It's a miracle that we have these words. Had Hezekiah not made the choice to make his leadership different, to make his nation different, we wouldn't have these principles to follow. I pray that in today's world, a man of Hezekiah's stature and wisdom comes forward and helps us to be the kind of people we need to be, not just as Christians, but as citizens.